So good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session on household and labor economics. Also, good morning, afternoon, or evening to everybody who is online. We have an exciting session with 4 papers on various topics in household and labor economics lined up. And our first presenter is Bailey Peterson-Wilhelm, and she'll be talking about recall bias in farm labor. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, so I am Bailey Peterson-Wilhelm. I am a graduate student at Kansas State University, and today I have some work done with my advisor, Dr. Ben Schwab, called How Does Recall Bias in Farm Labor Impact Separability Tests? So I appreciate when people start in square one, so this may be a review to some, but an ag household model requires that farm production decisions are nested within a household's optimal consumption bundle. And because these decisions are nested, this naturally threatens the assumption that production decisions for a household are made completely separate from consumption decisions. And so in order to test this separability, there has to be complete markets. And while this is a great idea, the test for this was developed in 1992 by Benjamin. And what this separability, classical test of separability does is look to see if the size of a household or its characteristics, so for example, household size or makeup of age or gender, statistically contribute to their total labor demand for agricultural production. And in the case where it does, that would indicate that there are not complete markets and the separability of household and production decisions does not hold. So moving on, this test from 1992 is still in use today. It's being expanded on, most notably with the use of panel data. But regardless of how this test is done, it requires accurate agricultural labor data, and that's for household labor and for hired labor. And the most traditional way that we get this labor is through end of survey, surveys given at the end of an agricultural growing season. Now, more recently, there have been 2 randomized control trials where they find that when data is collected at the end of a growing season, there can be potentially significant measurements. So the 2 examples that we've looked at is this Tanzania paper done by Arthi et al. In 2018, and they find that a traditional recall group, so a group visited at the end of a growing season, report 4 times more person plot agricultural labor hours than a group that was visited weekly. And an even more recent study in 2021 by Gaddis et al. In Ghana found that the same recall group reported 10% more labor person plot agricultural hours than a similar group that is surveyed weekly. And one important thing to note is both of these studies find that the marginal workers and the marginal plots, so those that are more likely to be forgotten, are underreported by the recall group when compared to the weekly visit group. So the thinking behind this is a weekly visit group has many more opportunities to remember their marginal workers, their marginal plots, and so therefore add them to their roster. And this phenomenon is called listing bias. And listing bias leads to an overestimate at the person plot level of recall by the recall group compared to the weekly labor group. And both of these studies consider labor on the person plot level. However, separability tests require labor aggregated to the household level. So when we look at these same 2 studies and we take it to the household level rather than a person plot level, Gaddis et al. Finds that the recall group actually underestimates the total labor demand. And so this is opposite of what you find on the person plot level, and that would indicate that listing bias, the inability to remember those marginal workers and plots actually dominates the inability to remember. And then in Arthi et al., when aggregated, there's actually no longer a distance. So that 4 times difference goes away when aggregated to the household level, and that would indicate that listing bias and recall bias even out. And another important thing to remember or to mention is that neither of these studies considered hired labor, which is an important feature when we're thinking of separability tests. So moving on to what we've contributed. So we take the first look at listing and recall bias on hired labor, and then again looking at the household labor, considering the previous work has done a good job nailing the very, very micro level. And then the natural next step is to ask, how does labor mismeasurement from the end of season surveys impact the reliability of these classical separability tests? So we use the Ghana and Tanzania experiments, the data collected in those. So in Ghana, they collected data in the central regions of Ghana in 2015-2016 agricultural growing season. They had 720 households that were randomized to 3 treatment arms. The first one is a control group, and they were given the traditional labor module at the end of the growing season, but I will refer to this as the recall group since they are recalling their labor. The second group, which is considered the most accurate data, was collected via an in-person weekly visit. And then the third group is the phone group. So the same survey as the weekly group, however, it was collected via phone survey. The original Gaddis paper did not include the phone group in their analysis, so that is another addition that we've considered. And then all 3 groups were given an in-person baseline survey and an in-person endline survey. Tanzania, very, very similar. They collected the data in 2014 in the northern regions of Tanzania. They had 854 households. However, they randomized to 4 survey arms. The first one is very similar to the control group in Ghana. They gave the traditional labor module at the end of season. Again, I'll refer to this group as the recall group. They added an alternative as well. So again, they were only visited at the end of the growing season. However, they were given questions asked on a slightly different scale. And we'll see that they actually find statistical differences between the 2 groups. But since we're more focused on the frequency of questioning rather than the type of questioning, we've omitted it for the most part, with one notable exception that I'll touch on later. And then again, we have the visits group and the phone group. The visits and phone group were the only groups that were given a baseline survey in person, and then all treatment arms were given an in-person endline survey. So taking a quick look at our summary statistics, there's a lot going on this slide. I've tried to highlight what's important. So like the original Ghana, these are from Ghana, like the original paper, we find that the visits group actually reports less person plot labor household hours when compared to a recall group. However, when we aggregate this to the total household, the bottom line here, we can see that the visits group and the phone group both report more total labor hours, and that's both household and hired labor. And another thing worth mentioning is that in the when we look at the household aggregated level, there are no statistical differences in hired labor. And this typically would make sense because once you pay someone for services, it's more likely that you'll recall doing that. In Tanzania, again, like I mentioned, the alternative group is statistically different from the traditional recall group. And so for that reason, we've generally omitted them, although something interesting to consider in the future. But looking at the person plot level, again, we see a vast amount lower for the visit and phone group when compared to the traditional recall group. And then the total household labor, we see no statistical differences, although the visit group and the phone group are slightly larger, so report slightly more total labor. And another important distinction here is that hired labor is statistically different at the household level for the visit and phone group when compared to the traditional recall group. And we can also see that Tanzania hires at a much lower rate. Their number of hired laborers is significantly lower when compared to Ghana. So looking at our econometric specification, we started with the original separability test. So beta 1 would be what you would look at if you were strictly conducting a separability test. We recognize that since this is not panel data, this may not be the most accurate way to do that now, but since that's not our focus and the randomization allows beta 3 to be identified, that's what our focus for this is. But just for reference, beta 1 would indicate if separability holds. So if beta 1 is statistically greater than 0, then the household size is contributing to labor demand, and that would indicate markets are not complete and functioning. But our variable of interest, our coefficient of interest, is beta 3. And what beta 3 will tell us is how treatment interacts with that household size. So if beta 3 is statistically larger than 0, then that would indicate that the relationship between household labor demand and the household composition is actually an underestimate. So beta 1 should actually be larger. And then on the other side, if beta 3 is statistically less than 0, then that would indicate that separation is falsely being rejected, or at least being underreported. So moving on to our results, we have the top one would be our traditional separability test. Like we said, this isn't necessarily the focus of our study, but it is positive and statistically different from 0 across the board. One thing I should mention is the first column would be if you were strictly doing a separability test. Columns 2 through 5 gradually add in our treatment and then other controls. And so we can see that our model is very robust and consistent across specification. Here we can see that, unsurprisingly, treatment is statistically significant and positive across the board. So that would indicate that it goes along with our summary statistics, where a recall group and the phone group are reporting more labor than the recall group. And then our variable or coefficient of interest is insignificant and very close to 0 across the board. So this would indicate that no matter our specification, the recall bias is not strict or is not statistically influencing our separability test. And in the interest of time, I'll only briefly mention this, but we can see that perhaps there is a different story there when we look at plots rather than labor. But since this is a labor session, we'll move on. And then we wanted to see if maybe it was a different story for the different treatment arms. And what we can see is that they are not, there's not one treatment group that is acting or behaving different from another. They're insignificant across the board. Moving on to Tanzania, again, we can see the separability test coefficient beta 1 is statistically greater than 0 and significant across the board. Here we see that the treatment effect is negative and statistically significant, but once you consider the median household size in Tanzania, which is slightly larger than in Ghana, that would actually, with the treatment effect, would actually be a slightly positive effect. But our variable of interest here, beta 3, is positive and statistically different from 0. So that would indicate that the beta 1, the separability test in the top light green box, should actually be even larger than reported because of the recall bias. And then here we don't see a plot story as much, and that goes back to listing bias is not the dominating feature in Tanzania. And then briefly looking at the treatment difference by arm, this is the only time that we included the alternative control group in there. However, we didn't group it with the traditional recall control group. We added it in as its own variable, and it is behaving very similarly to the phone group or the revisit group. So again, something to look at in the future, but not necessarily what we were focusing on here. So in summary, our results, separability is strongly rejected in both countries. This is unsurprising, but affirms that we were doing the right thing. Labor data mismeasurement affects separability tests in Tanzania, but not in Ghana. And if we think back to like the second slide I looked at, in Tanzania, the recall bias was significantly larger. And so in Tanzania, recall bias increases the probability that a separability test fails to reject non-separability. So in conclusion, our separability tests are likely sensitive to very high levels of recall bias. So in Ghana, where the recall bias or the listing bias was the dominating feature, we don't see an effect on separability. But in Tanzania, where there was higher levels of recall bias, we do see an impact. Hired labor could be an important factor here because hired labor was mismeasured in Tanzania, where hiring is relatively more rare, but not in Ghana, where hiring is more common. And so this is an important feature that we should consider. And then separability tests done with labor collected at the end of season seem to point that they would overestimate market completeness. So we at least have an idea of the direction. And our robust are incredibly robust to specification and cleaning rules. We didn't include that in here. They were. And then looking to the future, we hope to disentangle the listing bias from the recall bias. They seem to be behaving differently, and that's contributing to the difference in the two countries. And then another interesting thing is we see that there's a difference based in Ghana and Tanzania. And so at what difference does it make a difference? And at what difference is that change the decision of a separability test? So that's some things we'd like to consider in the future. And with that, I would love to entertain some questions. Thank you for your time and attention. Yes.
I have a question. So in your empirical specification, your outcome variable was labor, right?
Yes.
So is this only household labor, or is it like the combined household plus hire?
It's the total labor demand. So all labor used for that plot.
And my follow-up question to that is, now you're saying labor demand in the sense, so it's equilibrium labor though, right? So it's like what you observe in the equilibrium. So I'm just curious, are you, how the interpretation is specifically related to demand versus supply and how you parse that out?
So it's not a true equilibrium model. We're just looking at that, how much labor that household would like to uses. Okay. So we're not, specifically finding an equilibrium value. It's just, we're looking at how much labor did their household use, how much labor did their hired labor use, and then that is the labor that they would demand. But we're looking at market completeness, so there's not necessarily a equilibrium there.
I was wondering, in terms of differences between the way or the visits versus the end of season survey, you're saying you're collecting this information per person, per plot, and then aggregating. Mm-hmm. Now, did you see differences in, say, response rates, or maybe that you have multiple household members responding in the end-line survey, but that with the visits, the weekly visits, it might have been difficult getting those multiple household members responding in every round? And if that could explain maybe some of the differences in reported labor between the two treatments.
Yes, and so that was one thing. That was why the original Gaddis paper did not include the phone group, because there was some issue of people, and it's a lot easier to just not answer a phone call. But they used one representative for the house if a member was present from the household and could, affirm what their answers were. But they didn't need to talk to every household member every week. But there were, so we, in our cleaning rules, looked at different levels, like number of missing visits, and see if we look at different number of missing visits, if we exclude those that missed a certain number of visits, and that didn't seem to play an important role. The results were the same for the most part. But there is one thing, in the Gaddis original paper, there are some minor imbalances between the visit group and the revisit, like the revisit group and the recall group. So that is something that we'll need to look closely at as well. Yes. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm.
I noticed that the capital is very low in that country. And why you don't include capital in your model? I think labor and capital has a challenge. If the household put a lot of capital in month, maybe the labor input becomes.
Okay, so your first one, why didn't we include so why didn't we include the crop specific? So that's something that's been done in the past, and it's something that we could do. It's more of a function of time than anything, so it's something to look at. So that's a good point. Yeah, there have been some that will look at, like, not even include controls for crop, but they will, like, only look at the fields that grow the main crop in that area. So that's something that would be definitely interesting to look at. As far as the capital, another good point, we did include controls for income, so off-farm income and off-farm employment, and so that probably catches some of that. So if a household has more income, they're probably using more capital, but another good thing to take a look at for control-wise.
Because this is relying on dry identification on
those things which do absolutely influence labor demand are that assumption is violated.
The goal isn't to accurately determine how much labor they're using, it's to determine the impact of the treatment. So, but still important to me.
One more question. In terms of the separability hypothesis testing, would it be an idea to do this, for instance, by distance to market or other proxies for whether we think separability would
Right.
be there more and seeing how the treatment is impacted?
Yes. In short, yes. Yeah, there's been some recent work done where they look at like how instead of like labor demand, it's like change in labor. And so that's part of that. So yeah, there's lots of robustness things or things we can look at and see if that's important, but yes.
Good. I think we're getting to the 20-minute mark.
Okay.
Very interesting.
Yes,
work.
thank you.
So much. And then next up is our speaker, Kigo, who came all the way from Japan and is with the Economic Research Institute for Northeast Asia.
Okay. Okay, I think I will take this out. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much. Okay. Not seeing. Okay. Okay, thank you. Maybe the Zoom on the people cannot see it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, if you go to the left below, and then the arrow, the
Okay.
green arrow, yeah.
The
So the thing all the way on the right.
yeah, maybe. Oh,
and then
okay.
share screen.
Thank you. Maybe it worked? Okay, okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. And my name is Qidong. I'm Chinese, but I'm working and living in Japan now. Today, I wanted to talk about my recent study about the comparison between agricultural corporations and family farms in Japanese agriculture. Evidence from a panel data. And okay, let's get started. I'm sorry. Okay, good. And as you may know, decreasing birth rate and aging population are becoming very serious problems in Japan. And the number of family farms in Japan has dropped from about 5 million in 1976 to about 1.7 million in 2020. And the average age of agricultural works has been up to about 62 years old. And Japan's agriculture output declined from the post-1995 and bottomed out around 2010. And a countermeasure put forward by the Japanese government is to develop and support agricultural production corporations. And here, I want to show some figures. We can see that the total number of agricultural management entities in Japan has been dropping all the time, and which is mainly because the decline in the family farms in Japan. But the agricultural corporation, its number is rising all the time. About about 3% in total. I mean, and there are several types of agricultural corporation in Japan. Here, we might want to define the agricultural corporations at first. First, you have to register as a legal person, and the process of setting up and something like that must satisfy the conditions of legal person in Japan. But as for me, I think the most distinguished feature between the agricultural corporations and the family household is that the separation of household and business in income and expenditure. And here, the research questions in my study, the first question is that, are agricultural corporations more efficient than family farms? I mean, traditional family farms. This is the first question. And the second one will be, if there exists a significant disparity in the production efficiency between the two, what factor can explain for such disparity? And here, the first question can also be put in that way. Will or can family farms be replaced by agricultural corporations in Japan? In terms of industrial production, a corporation is considered and has been proved to be more efficient than a household or an individual, right? That's why large factories replaced the family workshops following the fourth industrial revolution. But how about agricultural production? The general reason why family farm has a dominant position in agriculture have several explanations for that. For example, Agates and Tsuyi had argued that it's far more difficult to expand the farm size through agricultural land transaction than to improve labor productivity from the process of machine technology progress. And the third argued that his famous hypothesis that peasant house may be poor but very effective. I think, and also the transaction cost in family farms is much smaller than that in agriculture corporations, right? Here in this study and in most studies, we define land size as the business scale. However, and anyway, the research objectives in this study, the first is to measure and compare the production efficiency between traditional family farms and agricultural corporations. And the second one will be to examine and explain the reasons behind the production efficiency disparity between the two, if it exists some. And secondly, I want to introduce the product scale. The two graphs is about the distribution of family farms and agricultural corporations in farm size in Japan from the most recent date. I think it's 2022. And I want to show that on average, family farms in Japan, in Japanese agriculture is much smaller than the average size of agricultural corporations. This information is very important, and we will talk about it later. And here, this is the relationship between the percentage of agricultural corporations by region and the cultivated land area per agriculture management entity in Japan. And from those graphs, we can see that, firstly, agricultural corporations are much larger than family farms in land scale in Japanese agriculture. Secondly, the regions with a large cultivated land area per agriculture management entity seem to develop the agricultural corporations more likely. And here, there's so much existing literature on farm size here. To save time, I want to skip this. Maybe you guys are quite familiar with this field. I mean, and to measure the production efficiency between the agricultural corporations and the traditional family farms, I use the method of data development analysis. And also I skipped these equations, but I want to focus on the data because I use the aggregate from the Japanese office database. And main objects in this study are those, the farmers, the family farms, and the agricultural corporations, whose rice sales amount is much larger than 18% of the total sales amount of agricultural products. Why? Because I think it's very important to put the two comparable. Because if I compare a agricultural corporation who mainly produce apple with a traditional household family farm, I mean, who mainly produce rice, it's meaningless. So to make my results comparable and meaningful, I focus on those who mainly produce and sell rice. Okay, and the decision making utilities in this study are the groups of agriculture management entities of different rice business size. And for all of them, I divide them into 3 groups according to their business scale, right? And here's the input and output variables in my model. And I want to say that the input variables consist of labor input in hours and the cultivated land and agriculture fixed assets at a constant price. And the output, I use the rice output in kilogram. Here, at first, I want to show the aggregated results of efficiency score. And from this table, we can see that on average in Japanese agriculture, family farms have a high efficiency score than the agricultural corporations, which is quite interesting because before the analysis, I think the later might be performed better in the efficiency score. But actually, the result turns out that for each year, family farms have a high score than the agriculture corporations, and their disparity is significant statistically. Okay, sorry. And here, I also use the aggregated results, but I separate them according to the groups. And here we can see that if the land size increase, the efficiency score also goes up, right? Both for the family farm and for the corporations. And also, I use the DEA method for each group within each group. Here we can see using this method in such a way we can control the land scale effect. And within each group, family farm perform much better than agriculture corporations, right? For each group, the efficiency score of family farms are much higher. And here from where I want to sum up a little, from the graded DEA, we can say the family farms perform better. And within each group, the family farms also perform better. So on average, family farms produce rice more efficiently than agriculture corporations. And the next question is that, as far as I know, agriculture corporations develop very fast in Japanese agriculture. Why? Because the traditional family farms perform better in the efficiency score, right? But how can that happen? So I try to attempt to explain it from the perspective of usage of input factor. And first, I regression on the aggregated efficiency score, and I found that the ratio of borrowed land has a significant and a negative effect on the efficiency score. And by the way, the agriculture corporations are much higher in the ratio of borrowed land. And furthermore, I use the regression for each group. I found that if the land scale is rising and the ratio of employed labor, its coefficient becomes from a positive and significant one into a positive but negative one, and where agricultural corporations has a high ratio of employed labor. So we can say why the agricultural corporations has a low efficiency score, maybe 2 reasons. They have a higher ratio of borrowed land and a high ratio of hired labor. That may be why. But how can we explain the development of agriculture corporation in Japan? Before the analysis about is mainly about the productivity problem, but actually more importantly is the profitability, I think. For example, if the agricultural corporations can sell the same type rice at a high price, and they can deal with the risk much better, and they have a low cost. So it's reasonable in Japan that the agricultural corporation develop well than the traditional farms. And here, some comparison between the two. to make it short, we focus on the total, right? On average, the rice price for the agricultural corporation is much high, is a little high than the family farms. And the net profit per entity is also higher in agriculture corporations. But for group 2, it's very weird but interesting. And this is about the comparison for its land scale. And here I want to draw the conclusion that in terms of gross output, I found that family farms produce rice more efficiently than agriculture corporation in Japanese rice production. And the large scale performs better in production efficiency than the medium size and the small size, both in family farms and agriculture corporations. However, no matter on which scale, family farms are superior to agriculture corporations. And the reason for that, maybe agriculture corporation has a high ratio of borrowed land and high ratios of hired labor. I think that's the reason. However, those findings do not explain why agriculture corporations have developed so well and fast in Japan. Then I explained the sale price and the net profit and found that agriculture corporations have an advantage over family farms, which makes them net profits per entity rather considerable. However, when it comes to the net profits per hourly owned labor, family farms are still superior to agriculture corporations. That's all. I think I will stop here. Thank you. Sorry. Any question? Thank you.
How do you, I'm a little confused about the data on labor. So for family farms, is this only hired labor or is this the labor that they supply?
Okay, thank you.
So are we missing, is this just two different?
Okay, thank you. When I conducted the DEA method, I used the labor hours as input. At that time, I used the total, the family hour plus the hired labor hour. But here, to account for the difference, I use the percentage of hired labor in the total hours, which includes the family hour and the hired hour both. Do I make myself clear? Okay, thank you. Any question? Okay.
So I was wondering, like in developing countries, sort of one of the reasons for why small firms or small farms are considered to be more efficient than larger farms is because of a recall or like a sort of reporting bias in land size. And I think that that's also actually building on the previous talk about recall bias. I'm wondering how in this setting, or if we should actually be worried about that as well, that there is misreporting of land size, maybe especially by family farms, because you don't measure this accurately. And maybe you say, yeah, I'm growing 11 acres. Because land goes in the denominator, it kind of inflates some of the biases. And can you say a little bit more about that, the potential measurement error in land size that might be driving differences between corporations and family farms?
Okay, I see. Thank you for your question. Actually, I must to say that I'm not familiar with the answer because I'm conducting an investigation now, but I haven't received the results, so I don't know the specific situation in Japan. But before that, I did some research on the land size in China, the developing country. And if you look for the land scale, according to China's office data, you can see a big break in its office data. Because this is because the statistical maybe is some errors in it. And I think in Japan, in the case of Japan, the research and the government want to figure this out because it's really hard to measure the land scale for them. And now one of my colleagues focus on this problem, figuring out this problem by using the GIS, the satellite, the information satellite. So we can take pictures from the outer space. And if we compare the pictures with the office statistics, we can make some corrections to the office date. That's in one option, but I'm not familiar with that field. Okay, but in developing country, I think it's more difficult, like in Africa. I mean that. Okay, thank you. Thank you for it. Okay, thank you.
So you had a slide in the beginning that showed the distribution of the farms by size. It was really
I get one.
interesting. Yeah. So I have two questions about this slide.
Please.
One is there are a lot of very small agricultural corporations. That surprised me, right?
In Japan?
In Japan, right? So look at how many, the percentage, it's the modal agricultural corporation farm is less than 1%. So one question is, why are there such small, why do we see farms incorporate with such small land?
Okay, I see.
And then the second question is, once you do your sample, you know, in your sample with the 80% rice farming, what does this look like?
Okay.
Is this totally different now, or how many farms are losing?
Okay, okay, thank you. For your first question, honestly, I'm not quite familiar with United States. Maybe the United States is very different from the Asian countries. But in China and in Japan, a small scale family farm is very common because we have too much population, agricultural population, but the arable land is quite limited. So that makes the business scale for each household is quite small. So we have very concentrated house family farms in the small scale. And let's see. And about the agriculture corporations, in Japanese agriculture, the popular topic is about how to make the land gathered together by the transaction. And maybe it's very hard because people, usually the agriculture population, want to host their own land and don't want anybody to borrow or to buy from this. So it's very difficult. But in Japan, because the aging population is becoming so serious, so the traditional family farms don't have enough labor to grow rice again. So they have to lend their land to the agriculture corporations or to other people. So the average land scale of agriculture corporations is much higher. That's one reason. And another, I think, very important thing is that agriculture corporations, maybe you have noticed that, according to my results, that when the land scale is quite small, the difference is quite big, right? But if the land scale is less than 20 hectares, they don't much so difference, right? That's the productivity. That makes sense that only in a large land scale, the agriculture corporations is meaningful, is reasonable. So that's why the agriculture corporations and have a high average land scale, and why also the agriculture corporations, which and the 1 hectare are still so many. This is because in Japan, even one person traditional family farm can register as a legal person. So it means one family, one company. So this part is rather considerable. So we have this graph. And do I make myself clear?
Yeah, so it's like family farms that become
a company,
corporate for some reason. So
yeah. I'm very excited and interested in this topic because if I compare the agricultural corporations between the traditional family farms, they are quite different, right? But if I compare those, I think it's meaningful. It's more meaningful because one person family one-person family farm and one-person company. And I think the decision, maybe the investment, just like the first person, the separating over income and sorry, like might different. And to be so, for the second question, I'm sorry about the. Yeah. Okay, we can talk later if you are interested. Thank you very much. Sorry about time.
No worries, no worries. I'm just trying to be subtle. Our next speaker is Zachariah Rutledge. I hope I pronounced that correctly.
That's fine. Yeah, Zach is fine.
I should have checked with you too.
No worries.
And Zach is from Purdue University.
Actually, they have it wrong on the website. I'm a postdoc at Arizona State University.
That's right. You did mention that before.
Give me a sec. A lot of we noticed a lot of people's were on the website. So. Okay, let's see here. Let's see. All right. Okay, let me. Yeah, it's not working. Oh, maybe I need to click on there. No, but there it goes. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining my talk. Marcelo, I see you're out there online. Nice to see you joining. I would like to preface this talk by the fact that I wasn't planning on presenting it. And in fact, my co-author Tim was supposed to be presenting it, and he texted me or emailed me about 20 minutes before and was like, oh, hey, actually, by the way, can you go ahead and present it? So I'm going to be winging this a little bit. Okay, so our paper is titled Agricultural Labor and Bargaining Power. And so to kind of give a little bit of background as to what our topic is about, if this graph here shows the employment rate, the unemployment rate during before and after the COVID pandemic was starting. And you can see that there was this huge spike in unemployment, kind of started tapering off in the months and a year afterwards. And so over this period of time, if you are not aware, wages have been, rising in the US. And so this graph here shows basically wage increases for a bunch of different agricultural industries. And so you can see that in almost all cases, the wages have actually increased very significantly, above 10% in most cases, and in some cases as much as 60% or more. So Tim has this interesting slide up here. And so we're going to basically be looking at, before I read this slide here, basically what our study is going to be looking at is essentially how did the COVID-19 pandemic impact the bargaining power of workers in the agricultural sector. So sorry if I didn't mention that before. So I'm going to read this quote here that Tim pulled out. I'm not sure where he got it from, but it says, the Black Death had returned again to England in 1379 in an epidemic that eventually lasted for 4 years. The effect of this, coming on top of the first wave in 1348 and 1349 and the Children's Plague, caused the entire structure of medieval society to change. And labor, which was once abundant, basically became scarce and expensive. And so he's trying to provide a parallel to what we're experiencing here in the COVID-19 pandemic. And so it turns out to combat the threat of high wages and whatnot during that period of time, King Edward III's government passed restrictive legislation that set limits on wages and basically punished people that were going to work for higher wages. Of course, we're not seeing that in the US. What we're actually seeing is that wages are skyrocketing, right? The big picture of our story is that we had this great resignation as a result of the pandemic, where people were dissatisfied with their jobs. We saw this huge increase in unemployment. And then we saw that there was this huge stimulus that created all these unemployment benefits. that may have impacted partially to some degree the bargaining position of workers, since they have a better opportunity to earn income by not working. And so that puts them in a position where they are able to essentially be in a better negotiating position in terms of entering into employment agreements. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're basically going to analyze how wages have responded to the COVID-19, and specifically whether or not that's related to labor shortages. We're going to also kind of look at this in the context of bargaining power. And when I say bargaining power, what I mean is bargaining power is going to be the share of the economic surplus in the employee-employer relationship that goes to the employees, essentially. And so that's going to be basically the focus of what we're looking at in the study, is how does that share of the surplus change, specifically because of the pandemic. So we're going to look basically in 2020 and 2021, and we're going to basically estimate a structural model that's going to identify these parameters empirically, and then we're going to compare this over time to essentially figure out whether or not the pandemic put workers in a better position, essentially, and quantify that. And so the policy questions that we're also going to ask in this paper is we're going to look at how minimum wages actually impact equilibrium wages, how unemployment benefits during that period of time may have impacted wages, and then a couple of other outcomes as well. So our paper is rooted in the structural search and match literature. And so this work kind of extends from the Bergin search and match theory. We're going to be kind of doing an extension to that, which involves basically where workers and employers enter into some kind of negotiation process rather than just workers taking wages. And so that's going to basically affect the structure of the theoretical model that we are going to be estimating. And then, so this is just a slide of some of the literature that has covered these types of structural modeling approaches. And so I'm not going to get into that too much. So a summary of our findings are that basically wages in the food and agricultural sector rose very significantly over the period of time between 2020 and 2021. So if we look at the American Community Survey data, which is the ACS data, the average wages show a rise in wages by almost 20% over that period of time, which is huge if you think about it, because wage inflation typically is just a couple of percent a year. So this is, pretty dramatic. And so we also find some other things. So we're also basically gonna, let's see what we have here. I'll just skip the rest of this. So, okay. So basically what we're gonna be doing in this study is we're going to be the first application of search, match, and bargaining in the context of the agricultural industry. I'm not sure if that's entirely true, because Tim has another paper that looks at search and match. I guess the bargaining component is what's new here for us. And then we're going to look at the insights into COVID-19 response effect on labor markets. We'll help explain or try to see the extent to which labor markets are contributing to the rise in food price inflation, at least kind of anecdotally. And then we're going to kind of just highlight how this is also related to supply chain problems in agriculture, and also whether or not this can provide a macroeconomic explanation for higher wages in the food and agricultural industry more generally. So our empirical model is basically, we develop a structural model of search, match, and bargaining. And so basically what the model is where workers are basically trying to maximize their utility or their value out of basically lifetime earnings from, so people can either, you know, be unemployed and earn basically some kind of a wage or unemployment if they're not working, but then there's a cost essentially to searching for employment. And so they will continue searching up until the cost of searching basically just becomes equal to the benefit of it. And so this occurs both in the employee and the employer side of things. Okay, so I'm going to skip forward a little bit. So basically, the short is we develop a theoretical model. And ultimately, what the theoretical model does is it explains the equilibrium wages between or the equilibrium between workers and employers. And then from this model, we're able to develop a log likelihood function, which is what we estimate empirically. And ultimately, what we're trying to get out of the model is this parameter of bargaining power. So the parameter we're really interested in is going to be this alpha parameter. For the sake of time, I'm going to skip through some of this stuff. Basically, we're going to be using the American Community Survey data and estimating this model using employment spells and wages, and then estimating this log likelihood function. And then we're also actually incorporating minimum wages into our model, which truncates the log likelihood function, which kind of is a big deal in agriculture because there are a certain proportion of workers that do make the minimum wage, so that impacts the conclusions. So and out of the interest of time, I'm going to skip some of the summary stats here and kind of get to the basic results. So now these are the reduced form results. So this is like a regression of wages on a bunch of variables, kind of like a Mansurian model. And if we look at COVID, which I believe is just a dummy for 2020, then or post 2020, then basically, actually, I think this is 2021. So it's showing the wage rise after COVID. And what we see is that after controlling for all these variables, wages are still showing an increase of about 9 or 10% there. Let's see what he has here. Okay, yeah. So let me get to the main results here. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so this is the model for 2019. Okay, yeah. So it's actually 2019 and 2020. I'm sorry that I misspoke there. So this is the coefficient that we're really interested in here, the 0.268 coefficient or 0.264. What that's saying is that before COVID, employees in the agricultural sector had a bargaining power or an employment share of the surplus that was about 26%. Okay, and so we estimate this model for 2019, and then we also estimate it for 2020, and we can see that the bargaining power parameter has increased to about 32%. So we can see basically this significant rise in the amount of surplus that employees are gaining out of the employee or the work relationship. And so we can basically say that that has at least can partially explain the rise in wages and perhaps even the rise in food prices and other goods related to the agricultural industry as well. So then to conclude, what we're finding in terms of the reduced form equation or regressions are that mean wages have risen by about 9.3% after controlling for all these variables. And then, but if we look at the actual share of surplus that the employees are gaining out of this pandemic, essentially, so it's increased quite a bit by about 5% or so. And so basically, we did a bunch of counterfactual simulations as well. And so one of the things that was interesting is we were quantifying the extent to which unemployment benefits led to the increase in wages, and we found that unemployment benefits increased wages by about 5% or so over that period of time. So because of all of these generous unemployment benefits over the time of the pandemic, that actually led to a higher increase in wages. So that's kind of one of the main conclusions here, and I'll just leave it at that. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so that's a good question. First of all, I'll just kind of provide some background. We're looking at like multiple industries in the agricultural sector. So we have like, let me pull the list up here. So we're looking at the overall wages. So in a sense, it should be some like an average overall. So I think the answer to that question is that we're not necessarily doing that per se, because we're focusing on the entire industry as a whole. And that's including, let's see what all of these like sectors within agriculture. So to the extent that, you know, farm workers would be one of those, it could potentially, yeah, it might, you know, have some contribution in there somehow. So I guess the answer is I don't know off the top of my head, but we are looking at effects like just generally throughout the whole industry. So yeah. No, it's optimal matching. So it's people are seeking to optimize. Workers are seeking to optimize. Employers are seeking to optimize, and then based on that optimization, the matches occur, and then we come to an equilibrium. And the model is representative of that equilibrium.
So the conclusion then is that matching starts to
So can you say the last part of that again, please?
So as the matching between employees and employers starts to increase, like construction.
No, I don't think so. Not necessarily. So the model has in it a term that is actually the unemployment rate or the employment rate, which represents basically one function of the matching process. And so my understanding is that matching is actually essentially controlled for as a separate parameter in the model. So to the extent that, yeah, that more of that would be impacting the alpha parameter or the bargaining power, then that should be controlled for in the model. A steady supply. I don't know the answer to that, to be honest. So I'm sorry. I'm not sure if I don't know the answer to that question. I'm sorry. No. Yeah.
Do you see any differences by sector? For instance, if, you know, people were more willing to work in jobs that involve open space, and like that there's really a penalty to working in closed spaces, and that workers there had much higher bargaining power in the way that you mentioned?
Right. No, well, because we're grouping all the workers together and we're not really like focusing industry by industry. I mean, part of the problem is that we run into sample size issues once we start getting into sub-industry, because these are, you know, surveys that are done. And when you start getting into occupation level, then it starts reducing the sample size dramatically. The short answer is I think you're right that I would expect some of that to occur, but we're not actually getting into that analysis in this paper. In fact, that's one of the things that I was talking to Tim about. He was having me like review the slides a few days ago, and one of the comments was, I was just clarifying, we're not doing this inter-industry, right? And he was like, no, we're looking at all the industries. So yeah.
I have one suggestion for you to control for labor force participation rate. Maybe farmer direction change in labor force participation rate for and specific, right?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, right. So how's that affecting? Yeah, that's a good idea. I think that's a valid point. Yeah. Thank you for the suggestion. Okay. All right. Thanks.
And then we have one final talk left, which will be on valuing control over income and workload, if I can find my slides. They might be still here. Yeah. So yes, welcome again, and thanks for coming to our session. My name is Barbara Kramer, and I'm a senior research fellow with IFPRI. This is a project that I'm presenting, a field experiment that we recently ran in Rwanda, and I'm excited to be sharing these results. It's one of the first times that we're presenting this, so really looking forward to your feedback. So a bit of motivation for the field experiment. Policymakers often face trade-offs in terms of, for instance, introducing a new technology in agriculture, for instance, improved seeds. These might increase productivity and incomes, but they might also lead to a change within the household in terms of who is commercializing the output. So maybe now men go to the market and sell this new variety because the variety can only be sold in more distant markets. That would change control over income from the proceeds of that particular variety. And then the question is, okay, this could be disempowering for women, but it is increasing household income. So should we roll this out? Should we invest in this technology? Another example could be that you have climate information services that help households save time on the farm. But now how to value women's versus men's time and whose time to value the most in a way and decide, you know, what type of recommendations to go for with these climate information services. Or you might have women's empowerment programs that create new job opportunities that are increasing women's already overburdened schedules, but at the same time are bringing in extra income and control over income. And then the question is, okay, can you consider a program like this to be truly empowering if it is increasing workload and reducing the available time that women have for other activities? So those are some questions that often come up when we're looking at investments and thinking through gender implications of programs. In the tools that are available right now, they are able to measure levels of women's empowerment, for instance, levels of control over income or levels of workload. But the tools are not sufficient to actually say something about how respondents in surveys to these women's empowerment or empowerment surveys are actually valuing changes in the levels of those outcomes. So that was motivating the experiment, really looking at how can we actually value changes in control over income, changes in workload, so that can be used in cost-benefit analysis and impact evaluations and saying something about these trade-offs that policymakers might face. So we did this using a lab in a field experiment where we measured both changes in workload and changes in income autonomy or control over income. And also we tried getting at how respondents might manage trade-offs between these two. So saying, okay, am I willing to increase my workload in return for an increase in control over income? And so this field experiment was implemented with 1,000 respondents from full cooperatives spread across Rwanda. We invited both a husband and wife from each household that was invited, so in total 500 households. The experiment was repeated 4 times ahead of 4 major activities in the agriculture production season in 2021. And then in addition to the experiment, each round we added on a survey module, and this also included different types of empowerment surveys where we measured men's and women's empowerment. For instance, the project level women's empowerment in agriculture index that IFPRI has developed, which is called ProWEA in short, and I'll be sharing some data from that survey as well. So the first task that we did in the experiment was aiming to value control over income, or to elicit respondents' valuation of control over income. So we asked respondents for different scenarios what they would prefer: receiving an amount into their own pocket, or their spouse receiving 2,500 Rwandan franc. And so by varying the amount that would be going to the respondent, we were trying to get the point where somebody would switch from saying, okay, I prefer being paid myself, to I'm giving up so much income, please pay my spouse. And so that's what we mean by the valuation of control over income. How much is somebody willing to sacrifice in order to be paid him or herself? And then the second task was valuing changes in workload following a fairly similar methodology, but now we were offering people a day of labor and looking at how much is somebody willing to pay for that day of labor. So yeah, this is based on a paper that recently came out as an MBR working paper. And so here what we're really trying to do is valuating a change, or eliciting the valuation of a change in workload. How much is somebody willing to pay to reduce his or her workload by 1 day, because now they have that laborer helping them out on the farm for 1 day. And then we also varied whether this depends on whether the money is paid to the respondent or to his or her spouse, in order to see, does it matter whether somebody has control over the income or not, in terms of how they value changes in workload. So that was task number 2. Then there were a number of other variations. We varied whether the money was paid in cash or in kind. We varied this within subjects across rounds. We also varied between subjects whether they could choose what day labor was provided in order to get at flexibility. We are concerned that maybe women are willing to sacrifice more money in return for changing their workload because they need more flexible work schedules, for instance. So this treatment arm was trying to get at that. And then finally, we really incentivized households' decisions, and we actually ended up hiring labor for households in cases where they had opted for the day of labor. And that was logistically very complicated, but we had a good team to implement this, so that was really amazing. Also worth mentioning is we had, out of 1,000 respondents over the 4 rounds, only 2 respondents dropped out in the 4th round. So response rates were really great. And in part that was because respondents really wanted the labor. So that's already a precursor of the findings from the experiment. So a little bit of context, we see that from the ProWEA, we see that women are more disempowered than men. So here the bars are indicating total disempowerment, and you can see that the male bar is significantly lower than the female bar. Major contributors to disempowerment, to our surprise, was actually not a control over income or control over the use of income. That was actually not contributing so much to this empowerment, but actually it was more limited self-efficacy and lack of autonomy and decision making. And then a major contributor to disempowerment was also, and especially the difference between women and men, was high workload. So we see that women are a lot more overburdened than men, and that this is a significant factor in their disempowerment. So let me move to the experimental results. We're finding that women are willing to pay more for control over income than men. Here you see findings for the first round. In green colors, males' valuation for control over income, both in kind and in the in cash treatment arm. And then the red and the orange bars are for females, in kind and in cash. Now, if we look at the later rounds, rounds 2, 3, 4, we see that that difference persists. In general, willingness to pay for control over income increases over time, but the difference between men and women's willingness to pay persists there. But interestingly, so this is about 100 francs difference over a total experimental payment of 2,500 francs. So the proportion of income that they were willing to sacrifice out of the experiment to be paid directly was actually not that large, which I found really interesting, and also in line with the ProWEA finding that control over the use of income is actually not the main factor driving this empowerment. Then if we're looking at the willingness to pay for labor task, we're seeing no significant differences in willingness to pay for women versus men. And this finding is independent on whether we're looking at in-kind payments or cash payments. Also, it doesn't really change over the rounds. We just see across time periods, no real gender differences. But interestingly, the willingness to pay for that day of labor is pretty high. We're looking here at differences of around 700 francs out of the 2,500 francs that they were offered as their experimental income. And so that's much higher than the willingness to pay for control over income. And also that is then consistent with those ProWEA findings that there is a major disempowerment coming from overburdened schedules. We also see that it doesn't really matter on whether your spouse is paid or whether you're paid yourself. So very robust finding that there's not really any gender differences in willingness to pay for reducing that workload. So then coming to my final slide, conclusions. We were motivated by this question, how to value changes in different indicators of empowerment, for instance, control over income or workload, to say something about trade-offs. And what we find is that women are willing to sacrifice significantly more income in order to control that income than men. But when we're looking at how much are people willing to pay for reducing their workload, this is actually much larger for both women and men than the willingness to pay for control over income. So what does that mean? That in empowerment programs, really interventions that help households reduce the time spent on farming, or that help them generate labor savings, is very critical and first order, at least in this context. And the lab in the field experiment is providing a tool to elicit these valuations, to say something about those types of concepts. Now, what I also think is interesting, worth mentioning, what we found is that the valuations of control over income and reducing workload, we actually didn't find a very strong correlation between these valuations versus the levels of control over income and workload that we measured using the ProWEA survey. So they do seem to measure different concepts. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that levels of empowerment or levels of control over income versus valuations of control over income are not the same. And the same for levels of workload and valuations of changes in workload will not be the same. So you need to measure those separately if you want to use this type of information in cost benefit analysis of programs. And so what we're planning now is we're going to do 250 qualitative, semi-structured interviews in which we're measuring both levels and valuations of control over income and changes in workload in a much more in-depth way, and then coding it and then hoping to correlate that with the quantitative data. So that is work in progress that I'm actually really excited about, because it's a way for us to bring quant and lab experiments together with qualitative research. So I think, yeah, with that, I'll wrap it up here, and yeah, welcome any questions that you might have. Thank you. Yes.
So, thank you. From what you shared, it seems like in this setting, the households are in a cooperative bargaining model, which one would not expect, and I think that wasn't hypothesis on the test, and women would want, if spouses would want to are willing to pay more for control over their earnings, but we find that they want to instead relieve their workload. So do you have additional information to kind of validate that? Are you collecting or planning to collect more about the trust and reciprocity between spouses? Or do you also know already from your survey a school making
decisions on expenditure and savings within the household. Maybe that's what we try.
Okay, yeah, so we, the ProWea actually, thank you for the question. The ProWea has a lot of questions to the nature of who takes decisions in what to plant for different crops, for different agricultural products. Also, who takes decisions over how to spend household income for smaller expenditures versus larger expenditures. And that all goes into an aggregate index for control over the use of income. So the levels of control over the use of income that we then correlated with valuations in the experiment. And I think the interesting thing is that the two are not correlated, which is kind of telling me that these are two different concepts, at least the way that they were measured here in this context. And so, yeah, we do have that type of data. But it's showing that valuation is actually not the same as the levels. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? Okay, I think then we're through. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to this session on household and labor economics. And see you around at the conference.